Welcome to Face the State. I'm Ariana Bennett. Thank you for joining us. The debate over the death penalty is seeing a resurgence in Nevada after the state's first attempt at an execution in years got stalled. At the last minute, the makers of the drugs to be used in that execution protested, and a judge granted a delay. Now, the state has limited options for carrying out lethal injections, the only form of execution allowed in Nevada. So, some are asking, is it even worth it? If you're looking for a better understanding of the role the death penalty plays in criminal justice, a good place to turn is the prosecuting attorneys who push for those sentences. The district attorney in Washoe County is one of those. So I'm here with Chris Hicks now to talk about that. Chris, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. Appreciate you coming on. And when you've come on the show in the past, you've said that you are in favor of the death penalty. Is that still your stance?
It is.
Okay. So explain just briefly, to start us off, why?
Well, whenever you're discussing the death penalty, it's very important to start with two topics. And one is just how sparingly and judiciously prosecutors use it. And the other is victims. Both of those are often lost in this discussion. But, when it comes to whether or not we're going to seek the death penalty in a murder, we take that so incredibly seriously as prosecutors. We staff it. In my office with a death penalty review team. We consider all the facts, we consider the evidence, we consider mitigating facts against the accused. And so we make a very reasoned and judicious response in making that decision. And so if you look at, for example, the last two death penalty cases in Washoe County, in the last 11 years, we've only sought and received it twice. And one was Tamir Hamilton, which was just a horrific murder. This was a man who raped a 20-year-old woman repeatedly, and then 2 weeks later raped a 16-year-old girl, tortured her, stabbed her 40 times, and then nearly decapitated her when he killed her. And this was in her mom's apartment. And when you're dealing with, and then you have Mr. Bila as well, who abducted two university students, kidnapped them, raped them violently, and then ultimately abducted Breonna Dennison and killed her, left her lifeless body in a vacant field naked. And so we're talking about the worst of the worst, and that's who we reserve it for. In that 11 years that we've only sought and received those two death penalties, we've prosecuted and reviewed hundreds of homicides. So it's important to know that prosecutors look at these things so closely, and we make sure that it's the right defendant, it's the right crime, and there's an overwhelming amount of evidence. We would never seek the death penalty if that weren't the case. And that's often lost. And then the other thing is the victims. You can't imagine, nor would you ever want to, what some of these victims have gone through. And then you also have to remember what their families have gone through. Lives are destroyed because of the acts of some of these most heinous murderers. And so in that regard, in the right case, in the right circumstance, I'm absolutely for the death penalty. And the vast majority of the state of Nevada is. A poll last year before the legislature had it polling at 66% amongst all political ideologies in our state. And so I'm a believer in the right case, and I think most Nevadans are.
Now, not every state has a legal death penalty. So hypothetically, if Nevada didn't have it, if it were abolished, then your next highest, punishment you could go for would be life in prison, no parole.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that would then become for the worst of the worst,
okay.
Life in prison without parole.
So then, from your perspective, is life in prison without parole not justice?
It depends. It depends on the crime. It depends on the facts. As I said, we prosecute many murders a year, and we rarely seek the death penalty, but we do seek life without. And that's an important part of prosecutors' discretion. We talk with victims. We look at just how aggravating the murder really was in making those determinations. The difference between death row and life without is a big one. Those inmates that have received the death penalty and are in Ely at the maximum security facility, they don't have a very good quality of life. They're locked down most of the day, 23 hours of the day. They have no social interaction. And frankly, I think most people agree with that because, again, we're talking about the worst of the worst. Those that are in prison for life without the possibility of parole, for example. They can be in medium security facilities. They can have jobs, social interaction, seem like small luxuries to you and me in the real world, but if you're locked up in prison for the rest of your life, that's meaningful to them. But I am strongly against allowing the very worst criminals who've done the very worst crimes to live that kind of life.
How do other states do it that don't have the death penalty option?
Precisely as we've just discussed. But in those states that no longer have the death penalty option, now the attack is no longer on the death penalty, but now it's on life without. And so it's a moving target that always is going to be criticized. There's people out there that are opposed to the death penalty who are also opposed to life without the possibility of parole. And so where do you stop? And so frankly, in our state, our death penalty system doesn't need to end. It needs to be mended. It needs to be fixed. And so these sentences that jurors of our own community, they're the ones who decide if someone should get the death penalty, that should be carried out. Victims deserve that, the accused deserves it, and the jurors deserve it.
Now, I mean, you mentioned that it needed to be amended. I don't think it's, an easy process to do that. Obviously, we see great inefficiencies with this process, not the least of which is putting someone on death row turns out to be more expensive than just keeping them in prison for life. So what's the solution that you see to this particular problem?
Well, I'm happy to hear that you bring up cost, because in reality, that's not really accurate, what is often portrayed about the cost. Now, the one thing I would always say is you can't put a price on a victim's life. The victims of Tamir Hamilton, the victims of James Bila, you can't put a price on those lives, nor should you. But that being said, if you look at the fact that in the last 11 years, the Washington County District Attorney's Office has only sought and received the death penalty twice, that is such a small number. I mean, that is like 1% of the cases we've prosecuted that were murders. It's just not an overwhelming cost. And that's statewide. It's right around 1% or less that is actually death penalty cases. On top of that, incarceration costs, life without is roughly the exact same cost as someone on death row. So there's no difference there. The only difference in costs is all the litigation that goes on for so many years, and that's what needs to be fixed. As I've said to you before, I'm a firm believer in appellate review. I want someone that I prosecute and convict of the death penalty or any crime to have an opportunity to have that conviction reviewed. That's a constitutional right. But when it's done repeatedly and it takes decades, that's an injustice for the system. And that's what we need to fix. We need to tighten up those long periods of time, make it more of a priority, and respect the victims, respect what the jurors have decided, and respect what the appellate courts have ruled.
So then would you limit the number of appeals?
Well, I'll give you an example. Mr. Bila, James Bila, we took that case to trial. Overwhelming amount of evidence. There was no doubt that he did what he did. A jury found him guilty, and then a jury heard evidence about who he was and the aggravating facts of the case and decided he deserved the death penalty. That case went to the Nevada Supreme Court. The Nevada Supreme Court, quality group of judges, reviewed that entire prosecution, that conviction, said there were no mistakes made. He did this. He is the worst of the worst. He deserves the death penalty. He then had an opportunity to challenge the sufficiency of his state-funded appointed attorneys. Again, the judge said, nope, they were perfectly good. He gets to appeal that again to the Nevada Supreme Court, and now they're going to review whether his attorneys were good enough for him. After that, I think there's been enough review, because you also have to remember at that starting point as prosecutors, we've already reviewed this case to make sure that it's sound, that there's an overwhelming amount of evidence, and that it's worthy of the death penalty. Now we've had a jury do it, a court do it twice, an appellate court do it twice. But unfortunately, in our system, that's not the end. It keeps going, and then it goes to federal court. And that's just too much. And there are states and other places in our union that do it much quicker. And I think that that's something that would be, in my opinion, what Nevada should be talking about, not abolishing it.
Now, beyond that, and we only have a couple minutes, but I do want to get to this, is the logistical issue that Nevada is facing in actually carrying out the execution once we get to that point. Obviously, we saw with the Dozier case recently that they're having trouble finding drugs for the lethal execution. And so if they can't find those drugs and they can't carry out the execution, what do you do?
Well, I think you have to challenge it in court, the use of those drugs. But what's the saying? There's a lot of ways to verb a noun. There's ways, I'm sure you could talk to about any anesthesiologist that would tell you there are ways to do this where it's not cruel and unusual. It's just the constant battle by the opponents that just won't let it go. I think there are ways for the state to carry out this sentence that has been ordered by a court to do so in any death penalty case. And I would trust what the Department of Corrections does in seeking that out.
And if the drug companies keep protesting and none will allow their drugs to be used?
Well, it's going to have to be battled out in the courts. And then, at the end of the day, the death penalty is the law on the books in the state of Nevada, and we're going to have to figure out a way to make sure those are carried out. And so that, again, in my opinion, is the answer.
All right, well, we have just about 30 seconds left. Is there anything else you would like the public to know about this?
I always urge the public to not get caught up in rhetoric and not get caught up in costs, hollow arguments, but to remember the victims and remember the victims' families and remember what these people did to these individuals, the worst of the worst, these heinous crimes, and really step back and say, yeah, I think we should be fixing this problem, not abolishing it.
Okay, Chris Hicks, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Sure appreciate it. Well, coming up on Face the State, we will hear from the other side of this issue, why some are trying to get the death penalty abolished in Nevada, right after the break.